on this topic. I'm not one of those strict presenters, so you can go ahead and interrupt me at any point and ask a question. You don't have to wait until the end. Okay? So, one of the first things that I want to bring up is that a lot of what we know about autism spectrum has to do with what we see. You know, this is more of like what people are actually seeing at the presentation of the disorder. Well, they do this thing, this is how they behave, this is the kind of stuff that they can learn, this is the kind of stuff, all that stuff which is more phenomenological, more about what things that are happening out there. But there's not a lot about what we're doing as professionals working with this population. And that is not as much as, like I said, the descriptive part. So for example, on a publication in 2021, Mason and a group of researchers did what they call a meta-analysis of outcome research for autism disorder. So meta-analysis is when you grab all the research that is out there that has dealt with that specific topic, you put it together in one large database, and you use one of those like super weird statistical processes that I don't understand how they work, and you realize how the outcomes are coming up with all these different publications. So they got 4,088 records. To start off with, that sounds like a lot, but it's very little. It's not a lot. It's like significantly small. You can get like 4,088 about any other problem, and way above. So it's very little. And only 18 studies dealt with outcomes study measures. And it included close to 1,200 individuals. So just whatever they are thinking about outcomes, or whatever they're getting this information about outcomes, is only from 1,200 individuals that are dispersed in 18 studies. Only these 18 studies dealt directly with the outcomes of people receiving treatment in autism spectrum. 20% of the participants had a good outcome, which is roughly 1/5. Then 26.6% fair, but then close to half rated a poor outcome in their treatment. So it's kind of like a snowball chain of information here. First, there's not a lot of studies. Second, very few of the studies that exist deal with outcomes, and then the outcomes that they're dealing with actually in the few studies are very poor. Like, there's not a lot of other conditions that you're going to see a 50% of poor outcome out there when rated like that. So when they're performing this research, Mason and his group, they ring the emergency bell. They go like, okay guys, we have to start focusing on outcomes. We're not doing this thing right. The results offer that at best projected outcomes for treatment of autistic individuals are poor. At best, 50% possibility. Also, that the review of evaluation tools to assess autistic individuals needs to be addressed, both with improvement of existing tools and with the creation of new sensitive instruments that invest in differences and unique characteristics. Okay, we're going to talk a lot more about why we need more instruments and different instruments. And by the way, if you guys have some like, oh, well, where do you find that and all that, you're going to find my references in the bottom of the page for each slide. So, so we're talking about poor research for outcomes. Next thing, co-occurring disorders. People living in the spectrum or people with autism have a lot of other disorders or a lot of other conditions also diagnosed at the same time as they are diagnosed with ADHD. For example, children with autism, meaning children with people under 18, have 41% of them also have ADHD, which is almost half. And then 17% of them are diagnosed with a form of anxiety disorder. It could be generalized, it could be social. And then you have bipolar disorder also overlapping a lot with 15%. Have depression, psychosis, OCD, schizophrenia. So a lot of these children don't have just one diagnosis. They have like this several different types of diagnoses that have been given to them. And then you have the same numbers on the other column. This is for adults. Now, about the data, this is national for Medical and Medicare, okay, for what's state-sponsored insurance. This is not private insurance. So this is where we get this information. So it could fluctuate a little bit if we see private insurances, but it's probably going to be very similar to this. So what's the problem with co-occurrent disorders? What's the problem with co-occurrent issues for autistic children is that sometimes they bring in an autistic individual, and instead of seeing autism, we see ADHD. Or instead of seeing autism, we see anxiety. People have created a social image of the autistic individual that does not reflect the myriad of presentations that the disorder has. So people are expecting to see certain behaviors, certain things happening, and when they don't see them, they're like, well, this cannot be autism. For example, eye contact is a big one. You know, they expect an autistic individual to be unable to have eye contact. Autistic individuals can have eye contact with you, and they can have long periods of eye contact. It's just very painful for them to do it. It's too intense, it's too intimate. But they can train themselves to do it. And we'll talk a little bit about that later down in the presentation, something that is called masking. They mask the symptoms of autism. So that's one of the biggest problems, you know, that people get to diagnose them with a different disorder because they overlap and they don't see the autism. Some of you, if you're working in the clinical field, you will see sometimes 12-year-olds, 16-year-olds that walk into your office and they've been taking treatment for ADHD for years, and then it's kind of like your first impression, like, well, this child is in the spectrum. And then nobody has seen it, nobody has diagnosed it. I mean, they have fallen through the cracks of clinical attention, the school evaluation, because they don't fit this idea, this notion of how the autistic individual presents.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yes, the ASD stands for what?
Autism spectrum disorder.
Okay, and ADH?
ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Sorry about the.
No, that's all right.
Throw the acronyms. I'm
I
sorry.
forget. It's been a while.
Now, another problem that we have with this, with people having living with autism or in the spectrum, is, how frequent it is. For example, you have here for the year 2023, you have 1 in every 44 individuals will have an autism spectrum disorder. Now you can match that with the prevalence in 2023, so 23 years ago. It was 1 in every 150. So it triplicated in 23 years. Are we more efficient diagnosing autism, or is it something that is happening more and more? Right? And then if it's happening more and more, should we revisit our definition of autism? Is it really a pathological presence, or is it kind of like what other people in the field have believed to be just a different manifestation of our neurodiversity? So it's diagnosed 1 in 27 for boys and 1 in every 116 for girls. It's a lot of differences, right?
Extreme.
It's phenotype, manifestation. Now, right? Why is it? Girls tend to have less of those symptoms that we associate with autism than boys. They don't manifest them as much. They have other symptoms, and so a lot of the times they don't get diagnosed. Some of the research has shown that a very similar score in the ADOS, which is the test to diagnose autism, similar scores have made boys be put on the spectrum, where girls not be put on the spectrum, with similar scores. So we don't tend to see autism so much in girls. Russell and his team started to notice this difference, and they stated in their research, girls are less likely to be identified with autism spectrum disorder, even when their symptoms are equally severe. And they're less likely to be identified. So you have a high overall prevalence of autism spectrum disorder, which is already something that should worry us. And then on top of that, you're seeing problems with the diagnosis of females that probably have the autism spectrum. So it's kind of like another thing to worry about in the field. So they decided to say there's a gender gap here for services, for definition, everything. So there was another research done prior to the one done by Russell, Girelli and his team, and they said that clinicians were more likely to classify boys with autism spectrum disorder than girls, even when both sexes had symptoms associated with the disorder documented in the location of clinical records. So ever since 2011, they were already seeing this difference, this gender gap in the diagnosis of the disorder, which again is informing the field. You need gender-specific guidelines. If you use a Conners test, for example, to diagnose ADHD, you go to the tables to finally score the test. There's a guideline for females and there's a guideline for males. So you don't do the same scoring for either one of the genders. So they're advocating for something similar here. Guidelines that are specific with each gender. In clinical samples, females tend to be more likely to show accompanying intellectual disability, which suggests that girls without accompanying intellectual disability or language delays may be unrecognized because subtler manifestations of social and communication difficulties. I'm quoting the DSM-5 I mean, I'm not quoting somebody doing a research out there or somebody, I mean, the Bible of diagnosis actually tells us this. We know this and we're not doing anything, right? So, we go back again to the beginning, right? And we have a problem with the instruments at home with the definition, goes to a problem with how is it that the prevalence is so high, and then it goes to a problem with how the condition manifests on different genders. I mean, it's telling us that maybe a lot of what we think we know about autism, we don't really know. Diagnosis overshadowing, I was telling you a little bit about that earlier. People have co-occurring disorders and they will have sometimes be misdiagnosed or be given a diagnosis that is not autism spectrum because people just tend to give them a different diagnosis such as anxiety or ADHD or a combined presentation of anxiety and ADHD. Actually, clinicians might think that they're doing a favor to an individual avoiding the diagnosis of autism. They're like, no, I don't want to give him the diagnosis. Give him what? Things are already there. I mean, you're just naming them. You're not giving nothing to anybody. But there's this reluctance to do that, right? Children with autism typically have 4 or 5 other conditions such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder diagnosed to them. And then 69% of 8-year-olds and 53% of 4-year-olds with autism spectrum have 4 or more conditions diagnosed. So you get a kid, and this kid is not only presenting your regular thing, you have him with OCD, you have him with ADHD, you have him with anxiety, you have him with depression. Now you think about some of the characteristics to diagnose autism, you see the overlaps with anxiety, for example. You see the overlaps with ADHD. You see the overlaps with OCD. You know, they tend to be obsessive, they tend to be very responsive to stimuli. So, do they have anxiety or is it part of the disorder? So, differential diagnosis is also a challenge here. And a little bit of a image to show how this diagnosis thing happens. Obviously, the blue circle is autism because blue and autism, you know the colors. Have it right there in the middle. And then for each one of the most common diagnoses, we use a different color and a different circle. You can see how they're overlapping and how they're creating this really confusing kind of map of the actual manifestation that you see out there, you know, in real life when we're working with kids. You know? Is repetitive behavior part of the autism, or is it OCD? Somebody done an ADAS here? Somebody has ever done an ADAS, the instrument to diagnose autism? Okay. So if you ever have a chance to get a hold of an ADAS, check it out and see how many of these items to diagnose autism have to do with internal experience. There's none. You're not checking for internal experience. The diagnosis is done basically by observation of the clinician, but overt behavior. So I'm not asking the child if, you know, the thoughts are intense, difficult to get rid of, you know, hard to think about something else. Things that you would ask a regular individual that's coming in for a session and that you're suspecting OCD. In this case, they get diagnosed with OCD without necessarily going through that process. Right? So it's a little bit of things being overlooked. Now, off-timing diagnosis. That's a little bit of what I was telling you guys earlier. I have a 16-year-old kid comes in for services, never been diagnosed, never received services by anybody, and she thought that he was a little off. And it's in the spectrum, right? So children who show regression or injure themselves, have frequent temper tantrums, receive an autism evaluation 4 to 14 months earlier than those that don't have those conditions. Again, the social image that we have created about autism, if the child is not like sitting by himself in a corner, rocking, self-stimulating, it must not be autism. The same thing here. Right? Children who show regression, injure themselves, or have frequent temper tantrums, have more of a chance of being diagnosed. So this is a research that they did in 2018. Now, another problem with the diagnosis of autism is masking, or camouflage. Masking is strategies that autistic people use to minimize the visibility of their autism during social situations. So they'll observe other people, they'll learn how other people act or react, and they mimic. They do the same thing. They'll come into session and they'll be like, well, everything is fine. Everything is good. Nothing is going on. Everything is fine. So these are conscious, sometimes unconscious techniques as well, that the individual adopts and result in a less autistic presentation, right? Driven by the desire to fit in order to appear non-autistic and to form relationships with others. I start to realize that a lot of the things that I do are different, they don't fit, that people around me find them weird or odd, or even that drive people away from me, that don't let me make the kind of relationships that I wish I could have. And then start, doing this, mimicking this, imitating for other people. And then, like for example, a 15-year-old autistic girl that I see, and you wouldn't be able to see it. I mean, she's very good at masking, but then she tells me that when she goes home, she'll flap sometimes for 30 minutes, 45 minutes in a row. She's just like containing the need to. So it's not like they're able to not have the disorders, that they're able to behaviorally mask it, challenge the behavior.
It's like they discipline themselves,
Yes.
They know when and when not,
Yeah.
that they have to mask.
They learn through their interactions with others. Like for example, my dad doesn't like it when I have a tantrum, right? So I'll be able to just not have a tantrum with my dad, and then later on, like let's say at night, while I'm taking a shower, meltdown in the shower. It's not like the emotion doesn't exist, it's not there, it's just able to mask it, not show it, and then they find ways to express it that are less socially, let's say, impacting to them. Or they could just bottle it up and not express a lot. And that also produces a lot of problems. Pent up stress and
Anxiety.
and problems with depression, specifically, self-esteem. I'm not the person that I want to be. I'm not the person that people around me want me to be. Those kinds of things. Now, if you read any of the books that autistic people have written about their experience being in the spectrum, you will notice that that's one of the main things that they complain about. Like neurotypical people, which is the rest of us, don't tend to recognize that we have an equally florid or vivid emotional life as they do. Actually, some of them say they think that their emotional life is more intense than ours. Just they don't necessarily get recognized in that manner. We don't think that they're as complex. We see them as just, well, they just get angry and they just get happy and that's it. It's kind of like a very basic palette of emotional expressions. When in reality, their internal experience is the same as any other human being, like a myriad of emotional experiences that they don't necessarily know how to express or don't necessarily know how to incorporate because they don't have the same venues that we do. And if you think about it also, there's not additional venues or more specific venues for them incorporated so that they can actually express it. We don't have that. You go to school and you have autism spectrum and you get a 504, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to fit you into the mold of the neurotypical individual instead of changing the environment so that you can actually thrive. I'll give you a very simple example, lighting. The light in a room. Some of these individuals are very sensitive to light. So a colder light as opposed to a warmer light is better for them. Or periods of time where they can just be in a room that is without light, that is in darkness, can help them self-regulate. This is not part of any 504 plan for no kid. There's very few schools in the United States that have become neurodivergent friendly, meaning that they have created spaces that kids can actually use and to self-regulate and to feel comfortable and to feel welcome in this way. What we do is we bring them in and go like, okay, now you have to fit into this thing. This same 15-year-old girl that I was telling you about earlier, she goes to a social skills group. You want autistic individuals to go to these groups, and she's like eager to go. She wants to meet people. She wants to make connections, and she is in this group. And obviously, some of the things that she's asked, she answers in an odd manner. What do you appreciate about your friend Eric over here? Well, I like the fact that he has a very long beard and he doesn't care that people think that he looks weird. And people are like, oh, you don't have to say that he looks weird. It's like, well, I'm saying that he doesn't care, that he has a big self-esteem, he's strong, but you don't say negative things. And then she starts flapping, and they're like, oh, you don't flap, you're distracting people. She's like, well, that's how I show that I'm excited. That's how I show that I feel ashamed. I need it. It's my form of expression. So she finally tells me, like, Eric, this socialization group is not for autistic people. They're not letting me be. They're making me feel that it's not okay to be who I am. So, like I said, some of these things that we have in place for them are not for them. It's for us. Come join us. Come to this side of the team. The light is cool here. The music is loud. For example, Switzerland has a day out of the week that all their malls are autistic friendly. So they turn on.
Who does?
Switzerland. They turn down their lights. The music in the stores and all that stuff is not allowed. And the kids can go to the mall without the possibility of being faced with this flowing of stimuli. So that's kind of like what we're talking about when we're saying like we modify our environment for them rather than expecting them to fit into our environment, right? So there's a reduced access to clinical support and services as a result of difficulties being hidden. So if I'm not showing the things that I'm lacking, if I'm masking, then the services cannot be provided, then I cannot be helped. And also, women who try to hide or camouflage their autistic traits are likely to report that they feel distressed, think of suicide, and or struggle to function in everyday life. And this is a 2020 research, it's very recent. Now again, this is an interesting factor, like I'm talking about this research with a colleague, and his eyes go big and he goes like, dude, like autistic people thinking about suicide. And I'm like, yeah, like if they were human, right? Like, yeah, they can think about suicide. Like everybody, the human was a shopper, it was like, whoa, and it's, yeah, dude. They do. They think about having kids. They think about having a career. They think about being successful in life. Yeah, they do. They just like to spend a lot of time touching sand. Or they can't eat something because it feels weird in their mouths. There's sounds that just don't go with them. They're bad for them, right? So, masking, camouflaging has bad results services-wise and also internally, how the person feels about themselves. Imagine that some of the masking that you do on your social basis, because we all do some masking, imagine that it was something that just was so intense that it doesn't show any of who you are. It's just a complete mask, a persona. You start to suffer. I mean, you're not real anywhere. You start to wonder, I mean, the people that love me for who I am, or do they love me because of masking? So it's a very intense. Okay, so what are we learning here? One, the test and the clinical stuff fails to identify autism spectrum disorder. Okay? And you probably already noticed that I have a problem with dyslexia because every time instead of ASD I put ADS. So that's the first part. Our clinical information, our clinical data is not correct. Second part. There's neurotypical expectations for these individuals and no support for them. I want you to be normal. Right? What do we offer? A bunch of behavioral interventions. I'm gonna give you a reward if you do this. Look at me, eye contact. Positive reinforcement is not so positive. Increased pressure to be or appear normal. You might not be doing this to your child, but the kids at school for sure are doing it. And they don't have to do it actively. Just the fact that you are there makes you want to belong. It's one of our basic needs, the need of belonging, being part of a group. And then this transforms into an increased risk and a fabricated vulnerability. This vulnerability wasn't there before. And it wouldn't be there if we were able to regulate some of these environments in which the children are evolving. Then this results in a decreased access to care and a reduced help-seeking behaviors. And all those things together leads to what we were talking about at the very beginning, which is poor outcomes for individuals with autism spectrum disorder. So you think about all this time that we've been thinking about autism, and at the beginning, they were just follies, crazy, deranged. Throw them in a cage, lose the key. Then we became a little more humane towards them, and it was the refrigerator mom. Some of you have been around long enough, you remember that from psychoanalysis, right? Moms that are so poorly responsive emotionally to their kids that they just turn them off. They can't respond anymore. They become lost in their own internal world because there's nothing outside that makes them come out. Like they stay permanently in the womb, to say it in a way. Beautiful theory, a bunch of moms very happy, like I did this to my child, yay, So we have moved from many different, the drug theory, right? Like if you did a lot of drugs when you were young, your kid is gonna be autistic. Like all these paroxystic, stupid correlations that we went down. And then the genetic research in the 90s, right? A lot of money came out. And it all went to genetic research. We're gonna find the gene. We're gonna cure autism, right? Boom. Interventions? Any money? Genetic research. They didn't find the gene because more than likely it's not the expression of a specific genotype, and it's probably the combination of many, and then a bunch of phenotype other manifestations that have to do with, mineralization and it was a bunch of other mechanisms. So it wasn't then fulfill that promise from the genetic field. Okay, so sounds very grim. Sounds kind of negative. So what to do? And I love this thing, the Autism Speaks thing. This is a way of bringing awareness to the disorder. Well, if autism is speaking, we should listen. That's one of the things that we should. So there's not necessarily an opening for us to, find out what it is that autistic people want or need. Where's the research? We grabbed a bunch of autistic people and we asked them, dude, what's up with your services? Were they cool? You want some other stuff? No, we don't have that. We're very poorly tracking the results of the interventions that we do. And if we're tracking them, like I said again, this is not an internal reference. We're tracking it through the behaviors that we see outside. And we're tracking it in relationship to how well adapted is this person. Now, how a high functioning autistic person, they can go all the way to become doctors or master's degree and all the different things. Yeah? And so in your mind, you go like, well, ain't that bad. Then you get to be successful, you get to do these things. But then you have low functioning autistic people. Yeah? And it's a very different story. I mean, we're not talking about the same stuff. These are kids that are not necessarily going to get elementary school capacity, to process, reading or writing or math. We're talking about a very different kind of person. So we're not listening to the different manifestations of autism. We're not listening to the people that know about autism. The autistic people. We're not asking them. We're not finding ways to clinically find out what's going on with them. We're not. We're just focused on what we see outside, what parents refer to us, and all this other things. So we should start listening. This is Naoki Higashida. Her book is called The Reason I Jump. She talks about her own journey as an autistic individual. And I love this part where she says, one of the biggest misunderstandings you have about us is that your belief that our feelings are not as subtle and complex as yours. Of course, we experience the same emotions that you do, and because people with autism are not skillful talkers, we may in fact be more sensitive than you are. Stuck here inside these unresponsive bodies of ours, with feelings we can't properly express, it is always a struggle just to survive. And you go like, whoa, this lady's experiencing this? Again, kind of like the same thing that my colleague did when I mentioned the suicide. They think about suicide? They suffer to exist? They struggle with their condition? Like, really? Like having problems not being able to express themselves? So,
More sensitive?
yeah, that we have all these different things that we don't understand about them because we don't listen. Okay, what do I recommend? Make sure that you communicate a sense of safety to the person. Don't feel this aberration towards an autistic individual. They're just different than you are, and most of them are not necessarily dangerous or violent in essence. Again, another one of those ideas that have been socially driven, they can just become crazy at any moment. Yeah, they're not dangerous. I mean, they're just, overstimulated. Learn to self-regulate, to be present, and help others with their sensory regulation. You have to be stable in order to help somebody be stable. You have to be level in order to help somebody be level. So you have to work with your state. How am I able to respond to this person that is in a very clear dysregulation process with stillness, with a capacity to remain calm. So we work on that. We work at this leveling. Self-awareness cultivated helps mirror and attune. You gotta learn where you are at, what things trigger you, what are your, let's say, weak spots or soft spots, so that you can actually mirror and attune with an autistic individual when they're going through their issues. If I'm not really aware of these different parts of my personality, they're gonna get triggered, they're gonna get hooked, they're gonna get activated, and I'm not gonna be able to provide this sense of, I'm safe, dude, you can actually interact with me, which is the main issue connecting with an autistic person, demonstrating that you're safe. They're in a constant state of arousal. They're in a constant state of danger. The fight or flight thing is constantly flight. Nothing is safe. Listen to what is interesting to them and engage. Had this kid was super interested in Star Wars, so did a lot of Star Wars. Had this kid that he became very interested in dinosaurs. Oh my God, could he talk about dinosaurs? There's so many kinds of dinosaurs I didn't know. And then there's the blah blah blah, and, and he has a head that is like this and it's like that. Oh whoa, I didn't know there was so many dinosaurs. So you jump into their interest, you find them where they are at, and you engage. Now, be aware of boundaries and the structures and the structural needs in your environment. But don't forget to be flexible as well with them. Make sure that the place is safe, that is not going to be overstimulating, and also remember, that they also need an amount of flexibility to display their real behavior, to display their actual behavior. So one of the guys that is doing some of the leading research and intervention, Portes, he was saying in one of his conferences, which one of you working with autistic individuals had a conversation with them saying that it's safe to be who you are here. You don't have to mask. You don't have to pretend that you're good. Like, who has had this conversation with them? And it was kind of like, well, none of us. We don't. Yeah, it goes again to that, we're not meeting them where they are at. Sense of safety has to be demonstrated verbally, specifically to your environment. Like I said, even the lighting in the room, even the amount of things that you have, the kind of sounds that they're exposed to. So, a lot of this means we have to change the way we see and we approach autistic individuals. We have to change the things that we had thought so far to be necessarily true or the only true. That's it for my presentation. Guys have any more questions? Javier?
So what are some of the differences that make it hard for people to diagnose a girl?
Diagnose a
Well,
girl?
A girl, yeah.
Well, one of the things that they were saying is that, for example, the symptoms in the girls are more subtle, rather as they are in a male, and that also the girls are better at masking than boys. So that's two of the main things that they're seeing that are making this a big difference. Now, there's other things as verbal expression, the capacity to articulate and verbalize emotion, for example. And now they're saying males are not socially trained to do these things. We are, but not as much as females. So they're saying this social training is being reflected in the guidelines that we have for diagnosis. So they're thinking we're not flexibilizing our diagnostic tools to take into account social environment, for example, in this case, because they believe that those are some of the things that are present. Like I said, the other thing is the capacity to mask. They're better at it than boys. I don't remember other stuff. It's kind of some of the general ones.
And you also mentioned that what was it, the ADAS?
ADOS,
ADAS. So,
yes.
you said it doesn't take into account the internal experience of.
No,
So, you as a therapist, what else do you use to make your diagnosis?
well, for example, if you're thinking about an autism spectrum diagnosis, you gotta have specific things that are there, like the social impact, the verbal or the capacity to verbalize, or, this would be like language impact, and then behavior impact, and you're gonna have those three different things there. To be honest, we don't use the ADOS. It's expensive. Usually you refer to San Diego Regional, and they perform the diagnosis. And we have had clients that they're old, they're no longer in the age range, they're over 18, so San Diego Regional will not diagnose them. And then we go ahead and we do the diagnosis when we see the behavior there. But I'm not like the spearheading this thing, and I'm like talking to the individual about their internal experience and all those things. I'm finding out about these things kind of like with you guys,
Okay.
as we're talking about them, So this process of building better services for autistic individuals takes me on this trip where I'm finding out these things that I wasn't aware of. So that I didn't know that these things were actually something that the field was reviewing. So that's why we're like bringing it in to learn about these differences for autism, So I can't say that I'm doing a better job than the rest of the clinicians. I can't say that. No. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to say that I did that.
Mhm.
What else? Well, I thank you all for your time, and I thank you all for participating in our fair today and coming in and seeing our offices and learning about the professionals that you're going to be seeing here and other things. And if you have any other questions, any other comments, and you want to see me over there in the office, I'll be still meeting people in the little tours. A little bit after I have lunch. So
I was gonna say that,
Thank you.
you had lunch it.
Thank you.
Oh, yes, yes.